I wanted to welcome everyone to today's discussion on healing and hope, with a deeper discussion on targeted universalism as a strategy for transformative change. I'm Stacy Wegley. I'm with Community Initiatives and sitting in Cincinnati, Ohio today, and just grateful to be here with you all. We do have a full house and would love to get each of you to join us initially by joining us in the chat room. If you take a couple of minutes and just enter your name, your organization, and perhaps the community that you're with. Taking a quick moment as we'd like to begin today's discussion with land acknowledgement. We'd like to begin by acknowledging with humility that the land where we are today is the territory of the people of the Salish Sea. Their presence is imbued in the waterways, shorelines, valleys, and mountains of the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish people since time immemorial. As we go forward today, we'll be talking about how you as individuals and organizations and as a larger network are moving from response to resilience, really grounded in a lens that is focused on advancing equity. There are a number of pre-meeting sessions. Today is the first of 3 that will be leading up to your annual partner convening in August, and with the addition of weekly resources to be reinforcing and expanding our opportunities to learn together and think together before we share time together in August. Liz, we so at Community Initiatives appreciate you inviting us in to help host and facilitate today's conversation. Monty Roulier from our team will be helping to provide some light guidance in today's discussion between Liz and so honored to be joined today by John Powell. We invite you each to listen deeply, to add your reflections and questions to the chat as we go forward. And as the discussion goes on, please feel free to add additional resources, readings, other pieces that have been moving you lately or have been supporting your work, and share with others. We'll spend about 60 minutes together in conversation, and beyond that 60 minutes, be able to turn to some smaller group discussion, again, to reflect and share and to think more deeply together about what we've heard and how we might put what we've heard to work. My colleague David Gibbs will be helping to facilitate and host that part of our discussion today. Certainly look forward to our time together today, and Monty, I hand it over to you to help us jump in.
Great. Thanks, Stacy, and hello, everyone. It's really a delight to join you, and we've been looking forward to this conversation with 2 special individuals that I think most of the group knows well. Liz, of course, with the North Sound Accountable Community Health, helping to lead that up, and somebody I've had the real honor of partnering with over the last few years and always, frankly, learning from in the ways that she kind of graciously and courageously leads. And then, of course, John Powell, again, who's been part of your journey, but his work, his writing, his thinking, his actions have been highly influential around how a broader community is really thinking about structural racism, thinking about othering and belonging, and thinking about fresh ways of looking at this world through lenses and frameworks such as targeted universalism. So excited about pulling that together into one conversation. And just a little bit of context I've been asked to offer that give maybe a little grounding in this conversation. Our team has joined a handful of others nationally based on a federal agency request to really engage other non-governmental organizations and communities to really look at what kind of recovery and resilience look like initially with COVID, And that has manifested itself or taken the shape of Thriving Together, which we're calling a springboard. And the first thing that I think the collective recognizes that we're not trying to recover to the status quo, but we're trying to recover to a different destination, a different North Star. And that really is around thriving people and places, all people, all places thriving, no exception. And so without going into unpacking all the different pieces here, it's relevant to this conversation today in a couple different ways. One is that we have this legacy moment that we're talking about that is not just about this invisible kind of virus, this pandemic, but really particularly with indelible images of the murder of George Floyd and the recent uprisings for racial justice, a recognition that we are in a unique moment, a disorienting moment, an unprecedented change in many ways, and that in many ways points to legacies of not just kind of the making in the last handful of years, but they go back for centuries, including structural and racism in many different forms that are woven into our communities and institutions. But it's also a period where we're kind of rediscovering and maybe our interdependence. And so we are naming this as a legacy moment because it's a moment of both reckoning and choosing around what type of future we want for our communities, our neighbors, our kids, and our grandkids. And so there's actually quite a science around thriving, what it takes to help people thrive. And that's not just unique to the United States. And so that changing course, those kind of rainbow lines that go to these vital conditions that we all depend on for thriving, no matter what stage in the life course we're on. And I won't, again, try to unpack those, but I just want to name that we've been trying to really crowdsource the wisdom of NGOs that are working on places and things like humane housing and what meaningful work and wealth looks like. And I'll just double click on that pink line around belonging and civic muscle, which is one of those vital conditions that I think is especially important today around what does belonging look like and feel like, and how do we find ways to build our collective muscle in places like the North Sound to actually act on and create the thriving that we all desire, I think, for our kids and our grandkids and our people today. So the path to renewal is really an opening up of a broader conversation, not just these pivotal moves, but an opportunity to start to reimagine what a civic life looks like that really starts to address our alien democracy, but also a much more inclusive way beyond voting for people to contribute to civic life, or for people to contribute to a renewed economy that actually promotes well-being, that's not extractive, that really has economies that work for everyone and not just a handful of folks. And then finally, really opening up conversations nationally around what does a renewed emotional, social, and spiritual life look like? How do we break cycles of intergenerational trauma and really pull into the reservoir of our emotional and our spiritual strength? So I know I've just shared a lot, but that's a little bit of how we started this conversation with Liz. And how it relates to this conversation is that when we had this opportunity, we immediately thought of the North Sound and the leadership that North Sound and the journey that the North Sound through the ACH has already been on. Stacy, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide real quickly. Among some of the other leaders, of course, you'll hear Liz's voice in just a moment. So those of you who can't see the screen, one of the comments that Liz had made in this process is, I have an inherent belief that the more we take care of the people in our community, the better our economy and our society will be. And I'm going to give Liz a chance to really build on that. And then just one other quote that shows up in the springboard, Amplifying to the Nation, is from Daryl Hillier's Children of the Setting Sun and with the Lummi Nation. And Daryl, who I don't think is on the line right now, says, when we remember that we need to gather ourselves in the spirit of the moment and the spirit of our ancestors, the spirit of all living things, and the spirit of Mother Earth, then I think we have a real foundation for change. And I'd love to kick off that quote and those sentiments by bringing both Liz and John Powell into this conversation, and maybe Liz in particular to start with. What is this? We've been talking about this historic moment. What is significant in your mind about this moment in time, both for the country, but also particularly for North Sound, and what is it revealing?
Thanks, Monty. And it's amazing to always be a jumping off point from something that Daryl has shared. So I think the pivotal part of today is that it has sustained so much of the airwaves, the kind of the popular psyche, that there's something happening. And, the challenge, of course, is, so what do we do with that? And for me, the various layers at which there is pain and anxiety and hope and healing, to go to kind of the title of this session, that those things are all happening kind of interchangeably, they're critically important, and I think just put us in a very different space. And, I'm probably going to let John jump in, but, one of the things that really struck me was probably one of the most recent meetings that we had with a group of staff people from our partners who are people of color. And we were talking about how hard it is to be in this moment when your job is to take care of people in your community, and you're working within organizations that may or may not actually recognize that they've got staff who are struggling and also needing help. And so being in this very, this place where you're constantly having to play multiple roles and not always having somebody recognize you and take care of your needs as well. So if we can figure that out, that would be a pretty amazing thing.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, and maybe John, to bring your voice in this conversation. This is not the first time I think you've been asked this question around what is significant about this moment, what's being revealed about us collectively.
So first of all, thank you, Monty and Liz, work you do. This is actually a very interesting time, and I think you really might be, and you never really know, but I think we may be at an inflection point. We've had other crises, we've had certainly other killings, and sometimes there's a commission or there's a movement, and then we sort of slip back into our normal pattern. I think this may be different for a number of reasons. If you just look at this in terms of the uprising, the scale, the scope is much larger than anything we've seen in the past. I read somewhere that in terms of people advocating for racial justice, this is the largest movement in a compressed amount of time in the history of the country. We have the civil rights movement stretched over, but many people didn't participate in that. Here, you go to every town, every state, almost every city, and there's been some expression. There's already been change. I live in Berkeley. Berkeley's taken some money from the police and repurposed it to talk about taking the police away from giving out tickets. The University of Minnesota immediately ended this contract with the police department. It's going to do something different. Woke up this morning and looked at the news, and the Washington Redskins are, after decades of fighting, they've said, okay, we're going to drop that title and that logo. The Native American community has been fighting this for decades, and yet in this moment, something has happened. It doesn't mean that we're there or that we can relax, but it means it's a real opportunity. And the last thing I'll say, just in terms of introductory remarks, Monty, I would say it's more than a moment, right? I think part of the mistake we make is that we think it is a moment. And think about the pandemic. There are really two. There's the pandemic of racial and suppression of others that's reflected in George Floyd's death, but there's also the pandemic of COVID. And I think what we've done as Americans is that we said, okay, we were good more or less for 2 or 3 months. We're done. I'm going back to what I normally do. And as people said, we don't get to decide that. We might be done with the virus. The virus is not done with us. And we have no idea how long it's going to last. Is it going to be another 2 months? Is it going to be another year? Is it going to be another 2 years? Again, another story in the paper said, even after we get some kind of antidote, it's going to still be with us. That the scale, when you're talking about inoculating maybe 6-7 billion people. So I guess I'm just saying that we're still in something, and it's going to be protracted. And our institutions and structures and our stories will have to be reconsidered. And I think we need to sort of brace ourselves for a real protracted struggle. No matter how it turns out, it's not going to go away quickly. And those of us who've been involved in racial justice know that in terms of racial justice. But now we're compounding that with what's happening with the pandemic. So I think, again, this is just, as I was saying, more than a moment. I think how do we prepare for that? I think is quite different.
Yeah. Thanks, Liz and John, and for recognizing or kind of pushing on this notion of kind of narrow thinking in this moment as really a compressed period of time. And as you point out, John, there is some unprecedented change that's happening really swiftly, as you talk about in Minneapolis, or cultural icon in the change of an NFL football team's name. And wondering if you might go a little bit deeper in thinking about the legacies of that go back way beyond before the founding of this country in many ways, as we know in North Sound with our 8 tribal partners here. How do we move from legacies of oppression and systematic exclusion to legacies of well-being, of shared legacies for the future, acknowledging, that, in many ways we don't have the answers. We're still in the middle of these pieces in our conversations in our country, just as with NFL teams. There are folks that would say, we don't want to go back. We can't have conversations about the past. And we have a growing number of folks saying we can't move forward unless we really meaningfully address what's happened in the past. So I'm just curious how you navigate those creative tensions.
Well, I think like a lot of things, there's something to be said in both of those statements, but then there's something more that goes beyond both of those statements. So it is possible to get stuck in the past. In a medical sense, when we think of trauma, for example, trauma oftentimes what it does, it freezes people and they keep reliving the same thing over and over again, so they can't move forward. On the other hand, as Mark Twain said, the past is not the past. And we're fighting, think about this, we're fighting over monuments. Why are we fighting over monuments if we don't care about the past? These monuments are about the past. We're actually fighting over monuments, and fighting over the past is one way, potentially, that we fight over the future. You go to a doctor and, you say, I have whatever, high blood pressure, I think I may have diabetes, I don't know. And the doctor oftentimes starts with, is there anyone else in your family that has diabetes? What did your parents or grandparents die from? And you might say, look, I'm standing here in front of you. Why do you need to know that? But our very bodies are carrying our history with us. And to be a good doctor, to be a good practitioner, you have to sort of engage with people. You don't just cut off. The present is not cut off from the past, nor is the future. It's not determined by it entirely, but it certainly influences it. And if we're going to have a different future, we have to actually think about different structures, different stories, different cultures. Structures are actually, if you think, collective habits. That's what structures are. They're collective habits. So why do I go down the street a certain way to go to the coffee shop? It's because someone built the street that way. It may not be the fastest way in some respects. Someone built that street. I don't have to think about it anymore. I just get on there and it takes me where I want to go. So if we're going to change that, it's very disruptive. To tear up a street, it's very disruptive. It takes a lot of energy. It doesn't happen automatically. So if this is going to be different, we're going to have to look at what has been the things that has sustained the racism, the othering, the exclusion, the inequality in our society. It's not just people with bad attitudes. These structures are doing the work, and these structures are built upon a history. They're built upon a history. I just rewatched part of Hamilton. Interesting, not perfect, but as people know, Hamilton started Wall Street. We are still living with Wall Street. And some people were critical of it then, some people are critical of it now. But these structures are deeply embedded. They don't just go away. We live them every day. We get ready to have an election. We're still debating the Electoral College. That was one of the founding things put in our Constitution, in part to sort of exaggerate the strength of small states, and as a corollary to exaggerate the strength of states that have slaves. We're still living with that today, and impact of that today. So we actually can understand even now, and we certainly can't have a different future without embracing the past, but not embracing it to get stuck, but to understand. And so the last thing I said, Monty, is we're getting a lot of questions, two questions. One is, how do we get here? And two is, what do we do to get someplace different? So how we get here is our past. And it's reflected in our stories, it's reflected in, I was with a friend last night and I said, so when you were a kid, did you watch cowboy and Indian stories? And who did you cheer for? And those of us over 50, many of us grew up just consuming that stuff. You know, we didn't know any real indigenous people. The people we know were through television's portrayal. That was the history. That's the history, not of Native American people. That's the history of the United States. That's how we got to where we are today, through those stories, through those tropes. So if we're going to change that, we have to change it. We have to change it first by understanding it, by knowing it. So we have to know the past without being trapped in it, but we also have to embrace it so we can build something different.
Thanks, John. Liz, curious how you might layer onto that, because you all are already doing some of that work really around the past and the future in North Sound.
Yeah, there's probably like two, I hope I can weave them together, but two things that jumped out at me. One is, just this notion of having these two pandemics. So the COVID-19 and just understanding the deep roots of racism, structural and systemic racism. But one thing that happens when like our systems start to fail, we pour a crap load of money into rebuilding exactly what we had. And so when you think of the federal dollars that have been released, they are to prop up a system that on one side of our brains, we're hearing that's a system that's never worked for us, but we panic at the notion that a business is going to close or, a line of industry is going to be struggling. So we have to prop it up. When, if I was thinking with targeted universalism around something like CARES money, I might actually direct those funds in really different places than where they are being directed. And instead, they are being directed in exactly the same way that they always have been, because the decision makers are the same decision makers that they have been. And I think that that's both an observation and is it an opportunity? So, there's a piece in there. And then it really is, John, when you started by talking about going into a doctor's office and, thinking of a recent article in the Journal of the American Medical Association about how much race is a factor in treatment, medication decisions, who gets what procedures, who gets what opportunities in healthcare. And, even in your individual patient-doctor interaction, race is part of the algorithm that determines whether you get certain assistance or you don't. And that is so ingrained that it's no longer visible to healthcare providers because they don't think about like what created the system that was there for them. Why do we have schools that are based on property taxes that just kind of reinforces the notion that there will be really amazingly enhanced schools and really underfunded schools? And so how we try to, here in North Sound, where, I wish I had like trillions of dollars, how do we figure out how to take the resources that we have? And I think it's both financial and it's just skills and assets of the folks who, I've had the honor of being introduced to, and try to redirect those across the region and put them where we know there just needs to be some investment in order to meet the needs of, some of the tribal clinics or meet the needs of, this group of, people of color who are working within these amazing organizations that don't know that they're there and how to address their needs. We've got so much information, and yet I still have like large providers who are expecting they're going to be treated in a certain way because they're large and they're traditional. And we're trying to pivot that and say, because you're large and traditional, we're actually not going to be investing in you. We're going to be investing in a different direction. And, you know, that has been a journey that started before I moved up to the North Sound area. And we're trying to figure out, like, how do we take this opportunity and take the funds that we have left and invest them correctly? Because what we'd like is to end up with something that gets us on that path towards a region where people feel safe and they feel that sense of belonging. But it requires investment that always becomes an afterthought when you're in the middle of a crisis. It's a luxury as opposed to a necessity. And I'm trying to figure out, how do we make our community understand this is the necessity? You have enough evidence to know this is the necessity right now.
Again, Liz, just being part of some of the conversations that I hear with you and other partners in the board, I feel like you actually have stepped into that conversation. You haven't figured out exactly what that looks like, and holding this moment, if you will, that also there is a luxury to be able to even think about that. We have so many folks in our country and our communities that are really in a struggling and suffering mode, right? And so one of the areas I'm curious about, you know, just around civic life, John, you have talked a lot in your teams around breaking and bridging, that our civic lives and even the democracy that we've inherited was not designed for everybody to contribute, and that's an understatement. And as we try to reimagine what does a civic life look like that is inclusive, that where folks feel disenfranchised, that are threatened by the level and speed of change right now, and those that have never had a chance to fully participate and contribute, what does it look like to move towards a more inclusive, participative civic life? I know that's a huge question, but I'm curious of your thoughts.
Well, part of it is recognizing that history. And a lot of people feel like, well, I wasn't there when they took the Native Americans' land. Well, I wasn't there when they enslaved Black people. And now women can vote, so what's the deal? But every one of those things still show up today, every one of them. And some people feel that if you bring in a belonging and inclusive way, if Blacks, women, Native Americans, Asians fully participate, will that diminish something for other people? So there's a fight about this. And, you know, we forget, you know, it's interesting when you think about the fights around the flag, and especially now the Confederate flag, not even the flag, the Confederate flag, among the same people who will turn around and say, we can't live in the past, but we're going down to Gettysburg and reenact that glorious battle all over again. So I think it does have to be some education. As Liz suggested, I think it has to be also how we use our resources. When the pandemic first happened, I deployed my team to sort of start looking at things. And one of the things I suggested was looking at disaggregated data. And I have a team of people who do data, and they kept saying, it's not there. It's not there. We're not collecting disaggregated data. And there were a number of people, including quote unquote liberals, who were saying the pandemic is a great equalizer. And I said, that's not true. We didn't have the data to demonstrate it, but it was obvious that it would, when you take something and send it through a system that's flawed and that's structured and that's hierarchical, then that new thing will actually reflect all of those inequities, reflect that hierarchy, reflect that the history of exclusion and racism. And so people were somewhat surprised when they found African Americans were dying at a much higher rate, being hospitalized at a much higher rate. It's interesting. On the negative side of it, African Americans were higher on every regard. More people getting affected, more people dying. But on the care side, on the resource side, they were under-resourced. So there were no testing facilities in the African-American community. They weren't being hospitalized. They didn't have access to ventilators. And so it's like, again, just reflected. And then it turns to the Native American community. You saw exactly the same thing, but in some ways even worse. What was one of our interventions? Wash your hands frequently every time you come inside. The Navajo Nation, one of the largest tribes in the United States, 30 to 40% of the people don't have access to running water. So the intervention doesn't even make sense. And then it's like, okay, you can't go to school, so get on the internet. That's how we're going to do school. Again, large communities, both urban communities, rural communities, Native American communities don't have access to internet. So it reminded me of Katrina when they said, hurricane is coming, get in your car and leave. Well, again, it turns out 35% of African American community did not have cars. And so even the intervention was reflected on the existing exclusion. And then, in Katrina, which is very interesting, the press for a while was saying the country should not bend itself out of shape to help Blacks because they didn't leave. We told them to leave, they didn't leave. So they were blaming Blacks for not leaving. You're seeing some of that right now, where the Surgeon General, when it first came out that Blacks were contracting the virus at a higher rate, his first thing was, well, they ought to stop smoking and lose weight. It's like, really? I mean, just amazing. So the stories were wrong. And the question is then, can we tell a story where we all belong? So it's not belonging just of one group with the exclusion of other groups. It's belonging of all groups where no one is left behind. And if no one's left behind, it's going to mean different investments in different communities. I live in the Bay Area. We don't need another, Wi-Fi tower in the Bay Area, but they do in Arizona, Tuba City. They do probably in North Sound. So it's not getting everybody the same. So how do we use these resources to make sure that we address that? I'll give you one last example. There was a good article about Federal Reserve Board. Federal Reserve, the interest rates are effectively zero. It's trying to get the economy back on its feet. But the tendency is, as soon as, quote unquote, the economy starts to move, the interest rates will go up. In the past, when that's happened, it's not because the Black community or the Native community is really benefiting, it's because the white community is benefiting. And then it's like, okay, we solved the problem. We can start letting interest rates go up again. Instead of saying, we actually really need to look at those groups who are historically left behind and put things in place, and that's target universalism, to make sure that their needs are addressed, because this overall strategy, washing your hands, the overall strategy, sheltering in place, the overall strategy, keep 6 feet apart from everybody, only works for some communities. Yeah. And it's not that those communities aren't important, but they're not the entire community. They're one aspect of the community. And so how do we actually make sure that the communities who are left out, who are disappeared, who are ignored, are included? That's how we build the civic muscle. We build a civic muscle, and instead we do just the opposite. We make it harder for those communities, we make it harder for them to vote, we make it harder for them to participate, we make it harder for them to speak. So it really does require, in some sense, not just focusing on those communities, it also requires us rethinking all of our strategies, because many of our strategies were built to be exclusive. And so you can't just fix it with a small add-on. If you do it right, it's actually going to affect all of us. But it should affect all of us so that all of us can belong and all of us have a stake in the resources of this country.
Thanks for that, John. I wanted to just double check. I've been kind of following the chat, but I'm not the best multitasker in the world. I don't know, David or Stacy, is there anything that you would like to list up in the chat? I get the sense that folks have been kind of quoting and naming some of the things that they're hearing from John and Liz. And if not,
yeah, lots of great comments in the chat. A reassertion by Megan of this inflection point that we find ourselves in and the need to keep pushing. And Jackie says she feels seen and heard. I'd love to hear her say more about that and invite you to actually unmute yourself, Jackie, and speak into that.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Jackie Julian, Communities of Color Coalition. I'm all in my feelings, David, so way to call me out because the conversation is is so needed. And so just listening to what John is saying and what Liz is saying, my spirit feels like, as it was mentioned, like this time is different, because not only are we leaning into this time that is right most uncomfortable, we're actually letting that guide like the way we do work, the way we see. And I think Liz had mentioned it, that again, right, coming from community-based, a lot of the things stay the same because we invest in big business. And I'm just gonna sit here in my feelings, and I'm inspired, I'm encouraged, and I think, you know, it's acknowledging the history. And so I think that what's happening is folks want to do a quick solution, and we're being intentional with slowing down and making sure we understand what it is that we're dealing with. So I'm super hopeful. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that, Jackie. So such an important moment to not run from the feeling. I'm reminded of the statement, there's no way around it or over it or under it. It's about going through it together. And so that means both individually and collectively. And we want to encourage you all to continue to put comments into the chat. We are monitoring it. And we want to lift up your questions. So Monty, I'm gonna hand it back to you for a moment. Thanks. While we keep an eye on it.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I'd love to, with John and Liz, maybe pivot. Targeted universalism has come up. I know this is not a new concept for the North Sound. And as somebody who is a neophyte in really understanding it, but has some understanding reading that this, holding this tension between universal values, the universal aims for everybody to belong and to experiencing, thriving, and I add that language to that, and that each community and individual is situated a little differently and requires different strategies. So I know this is not a new path, but perhaps in this moment again, in the broadest sense of the term moment, what does it look like for North Sound and for our country, which shows up in the springboard, to really operationalize this targeted universalism idea, this framework? And Liz, maybe since we haven't heard your voice for a while, maybe you could just catch us up on thinking about targeted universalism and what's already kind of been done. And maybe John, if you wouldn't mind kind of layering on what that could look like moving forward.
Sure, I will start. And if Nicole is on and wants to jump in and add anything behind me, that would be great. You know, we were introduced to targeted universalism by a colleague from the Portland area, Ben Duncan, back in the fall of 2017. And it just kind of clicked for us as a missing piece or strategy around what we were doing with the Medicaid Transformation Project. And if I were to describe the kind of an example of a before and after scenario, I'll go back to John's example of going in and having a doctor say, do you have diabetes? That the ACHs have an expectation that we're going to move specific metrics. So if you think about a metric like, are you doing better at measuring people's hemoglobin A1C levels, which you do for people with diabetes? The doctors around the North Sound region said, well, the thing to do is to give doctors more money. If you just pay doctors more, we will get better at that. And what we ended up saying was, well, the thing that's going to actually make a difference is if people have better access to medication and they've got better transportation and they actually can get to affordable foods. So we decided to invest in community-based organizations that were supporting people in communities differently. And we ended up not giving doctors more money, but it was really a way for us to say, where is it that we've got some leverage points and how do we invest there? And so it ended up that our region took a very different approach. And then in addition said, we know, for example, that diabetes is, you know, the prevalence among The tribes is higher. So how do we actually begin to partner with the tribes, their clinics, their education systems, which led to this partnership with Children of the Setting Sun Productions, because in order to actually address something like diabetes, we needed to have different strategies than a doctor and a test and a lab. And it really helped us to think about which populations we were focused on, what were the strategies, and we were just so focused on how can we invest in a way that would lead to some long-term change and raise up folks who are doing the work in communities differently than they were before. Oh, Monty, you're muted.
Thank you. I'm just real quickly, and would love to pass back over to John, how this idea is being embraced by some of your partners, and by this is a new way of thinking, particularly for larger anchor institutions and hospitals and FQHCs and businesses. As
You're asking me or John?
You actually first.
Okay. I think that if I were saying what would have happened 4 years ago, I had a lot of primary care docs who were not very happy with me. What has happened over the last 4 years, they have been so grateful for the relationships, the partnerships, sometimes learning about community assets that were only blocks away from them that they didn't know about. Mm-hmm. And that they have seen things get better within their own organizations because they have a greater awareness and greater connections to others who are also working with their patient or client population. So what we've heard has been incredibly positive, because the growth that they've seen has been in building relationship with each other.
Thanks. John, please, wherever you'd like to go with it, as somebody who's helped create this framework, how do we move deeper into operationalizing it?
So I think, first of all, I want to just take my hat off to Liz and North Sound, because it takes resources, and if you understand it, it means you're going to use your resources in a different way. And it's even different than equity in that respect. It's certainly different than just saying we're going to treat everybody the same, or worse yet, we're going to give all the resources to those who are at the top. But it does it without rancor. You're not saying we're doing it because people are Black or because people are Native American. It's because they're situated differently, have a different culture and a different expression. And the goal is to get everyone to that universal, everyone. But you have to pay particular attention to those who are historically marginalized and historically disappeared. So going back to Kobe for a minute, it's one of the things you have to do is to have good information, good intelligence, good data. And what this country oftentimes does not do is have good data. And so, especially as it relates to Native Americans, you'll say, the country's doing better. And say, well, how Native Americans are doing? We did not disaggregate the data. We don't really know. And it's complicated because in the Native American community and in the Black community, there's a huge learned distrust of government. So generally when they're collecting data, it's not to help you, it's to hurt you. So part of that means also, going back to something that's in your report, Monty, is that the community needs to be involved in, first of all, collecting data, setting the norms, doing the evaluation, and creating mechanisms that they know will serve them because they're running them. So target universalism is all related to that and related to belonging. So again, sometimes when we give a community resources, we then sort of set the mechanism. It's like, I want to see what's happening. I want to evaluate it for me, not for the community. So targeting universalism basically says that the communities themselves participate and especially in sort of even identifying that universal. The universal can't just be given to them. But it is universal. It's not each community has their own universal. That's not target universalism. So it's gaining steam, but it's a little bit counterintuitive because some people think that we are all situated the same. So we're going to give everybody I mean, at one point, the federal government said something like they were given, I forget the number, but it was something ridiculous, like 100 ventilators to each state.
Mhm.
It's like, that's the opposite of target universalism. California has 40 million people. Wyoming has 1 million. We're going to treat everybody the same. The illogical of doing that, the logic of doing that is just phenomenal once you think about it. And so, but again, part of it means, first of all, lifting people up so we see them, so we know what's going on, but lifting them up in a way that doesn't expose them to danger. One last thing I'll say is that I was on a call with some folks and they were worried about the data coming out that Blacks, Latinos, Native Americans were being hardest hit by COVID, because they're saying, in this country, if you say that, if people are convinced of it, then it's no longer a problem for the country. Then it's a Black problem. Then it's a Native American problem. And why should we, then we can open up. Because if those are the people that are going to get sick and die, we're willing to sacrifice those people for some other people. So that was our worry, how we talk about this, the stories around this important, but also knew or deeply suspected that the southern states, and still this disproportionate, but the southern states, particularly who were taking that position, would soon be hard hit. That it wouldn't stay in New York, it wouldn't stay in Washington, it wouldn't stay in Seattle, it wouldn't stay, that this virus really does populate across the whole country. And that it would be one more opportunity to learn that this is not just about us, it's about all of us, even though it affects us differently. And we need to all lean into it together and use targeted universalism.
Thanks, John. And I'm kind of monitoring the chat. Liz, I'm going to do an imperfect job of maybe inviting you a comment that we talked about last week of, one, thank you again for the targeted universalism and the nuanced approach. And some folks I hear talking about it around equity 2.0 and just, how it really bridges this notion of obviously universalism and really supporting people who are uniquely situated. One group I think that is often left out but really essential right now are our young people. Any social change as we're really looking to change our habits and the way that we show up. So Liz, again, I think I'd heard from you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that some of your young leaders across the North Sound, largely people of color, have been wondering how they might show up and be fully utilized in this notion of participation and co-creation. I don't know if you want to add to that and then kind of what North Sound might do about it.
Boy, and now you're going to make me scroll through the participant list, because I think that a number of the folks who joined on that call are on this call. So hoping if they want to jump in that they will. I think that they're, going back to Hamilton, it was a great reminder for me that the Revolutionary War was a lot of young people. And, so as we think about what young people are doing, whether it's around the climate change protests, this racial and social justice piece, and it just goes back into kind of the 7 generations principles, that we learn about from the tribes. Like, this is their world we're talking about, their world, their future, the future of their kids and great grandkids. And so how it is that we can have ears and eyes wide open for them and create space where they can actually influence the decisions that are the questions being framed, much less the responses being developed, I think is just really critical. And, when you live in a state like Washington and certainly the North Sound region, I lived in Portland for 35 years, where I was always surrounded by people who would say, like, Portland is so white. And I would find myself not knowing whether I should agree with them or not, because I'm standing here right in front of you. Like, what does that mean, that you can't see me when you're saying something like that? And so how we turn to people who are most impacted during these types of upheaval and opportunities for change, to let them tell us what we should be focused on and what we should be investing in. You know, we're trying to figure out how we can create that kind of opportunity in North Sound, but I'm hoping we're doing that across the globe. But you know, that's my optimistic, idealistic self. And you know, and I don't know, you know, I think that Holly is on. You know, I saw that Cedric is on. There are just a couple of folks. You know, Jackie's already commented a bit. But if any of you all would like to jump in and respond to Monty's question, know that you can unmute yourself and do that. Holly, are you still there?
Sorry, I had to step out for just a minute.
Okay.
Can you,
It was primarily just where, like leaders of color, especially like emerging leaders and people who are younger in their careers, like where there's a space in decision making and kind of shaping some next step pieces.
yeah, I mean, I feel like we have a lot of new and innovative ideas that we want to introduce, maybe to the older generations or populations. At times it's felt like because we're the younger generation, we maybe don't have enough experience or know. And so really coming up against that at times and figuring out, in a sense, how we can all come together on that. I feel like we're at a place where, with everything that's been going on in the country, where we can really come together and start doing that. People are more open and willing to those conversations. So that's been very encouraging.
Yeah,
Thanks, Holly.
and Monty, you know that Children of the Setting Sun, you know, has their youth podcast. And so at our last convening in August, and I think it was Eliza that stepped up and asked North Sound if we would help do a youth convening, which, you know, we said yes to, and of course said, sure, we'll do that by September. And I don't know if that's going to happen, but we're trying. And I think it's another way of not having, not just ignoring the fact that there are people with lived experience who may not have as many chronological years as others, but still have the experience and perspective that's really important for us in planning the future. Like, how do we build that as part of our own internal expectations of doing that work?
Yeah. Thanks, Liz. And, you know, in the last few minutes here, David, it sounds like there's maybe a chat that you wanted to just lift up real quickly.
Yes, I actually want to do, there's a few now starting to come in. Mary Jo, you had a comment in the chat. Would love to invite you to expound on that a little bit. Mary Jo, I believe.
David, but just a little bit, because I think the Hollies of our group are who are leading us. What I wrote is, in this time, people with historic privilege, which that includes me, are turning to communities most impacted by racism, othering, to tell us what we should do. We're making them tired and wearing them out again. Studying our true history will help us see established systems in a different context. One roadblock I see is fear of owning that true past, what I call the "that wasn't me" syndrome. And before we can move ahead, that stops us from moving ahead. And that's where, so far, the work of the ACH under Liz's leadership, and particularly Children of the Setting Sun and Daryl, who I've known for 30 years, are really fundamental to the change we're looking for. I think when we've all been able to be together in a room, and we are mostly still white, the impact of the teachings of Daryl and his family and everyone working in Children Setting Sun, we're an audience that has to face things. And that is what really carries me in this moment. and making that work fundamental to what the ACH does matters very much.
Thank you for that.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Mary Jo. And I wanted to honor our time. And Liz, I think you may get pulled into the conversation in the next half an hour, but maybe just toss it back to you, John, for a moment, given the serendipity of the work that you do globally, but working in this space with the North Sound, you know, any thoughts that particularly give you hope, or how North Sound really continues to move forward with some of the momentum that's been created, you know, not just recently, but over the last plus years?
Oh, well, again, thank you for the opportunity. You know, I've written that what we're seeing now is a crack in this wall of oppression. And our job is to turn that into a hole and then take down the whole wall. And there are really different roles in that. Even Kendi talks about the difference between a demonstrator and a protester. But when you look at large movements, they're oftentimes literally led by young people. I think the Freedom Riders, the average age was 17. We forget that. You know, that's a huge change in terms of civil rights in the United States. They're kids. When we think about millennials are now the largest single group in the country. They're a larger group than baby boomers. And so part of it is to engage with them, to all the groups, but certainly those groups, to give them the support they need to listen to them, but also to talk to them. And particularly groups, young groups of color, which is, I would just lump young people together, because as we saw in some of the climate change work or in some of the gun violence work, we also, when we invite young people in, we oftentimes default again to young white people. They should be excluded. But the young people are even more diverse than old people in terms of race and other things. So I think creating the structures, capacity, resources to engage with them makes a lot of sense. And one thing North Sound has been able to do is to do some of that work. So then when this crisis hit, there are at least some beginning structures to actually lean into it in a constructive way. If we don't have, if we don't build those structures, if we don't build those institutions, if we don't build those capacities, then it will be a moment. But if we build those and take advantage of those, then we can actually have something that's enduring. And I think, you know, as they say, the wisdom of young people is profound. And you know, I have an 11-year-old granddaughter, and I lost my dad last year, and she's become my new teacher. So always saying things that it's like, okay, I got to check myself. I got to think about that differently. But the unfortunate thing in the United States, not only are we segregated racially, culturally, but we're segregated in terms of age as well. We don't naturally come together. It'd be great if we could figure out how to bridge that. But again, thank you for your work, and Monty and Liz and all of you.
John, yeah, thank you. I know that folks would love to continue, and I think there's going to be an opportunity, which I'll pivot here in a moment, to extend the conversation in some breakouts, and David and Stacy are going to explain that. But again, what a gift, John and Liz, and the leadership that you've shown, and thank you so much for spending this time. And the last thing I'll just kind of mention is to kind of build on what you're saying, John. Because of what the North Sound ACH is doing, there are some structures in place. So this isn't just a conversation. There are some places to really lean in with some new voices and with the new way of thinking about building those structures that change our patterns and our habits. So thanks again for kind of paving the way on some fronts. Liz, any last comment from you before we pivot into our shared conversation?
Yeah, I just envisioned John had just finished a talk at the Equity Summit in Chicago, and I walked up on the dais and said, hey, what would it take to get you to come to the most farthest northwest part of the United States? And, you know, when he said yes, and our team, you know, got to just kind of pick his brain about, you know, what we could do up here in the North Sound region, it really has been like such an asset for us to not only have John, but the people that John has connected us to, so that it has become not only a part of like what we're doing with partners, but what we're doing internally with our own team, what our board has, embarked upon in the last couple of years to, because this notion of a commitment to equity has been a long-term thing. And I think when I was being interviewed, I described it as, equity is always awesome, but it's always an asterisk. It's an appendix, it's an asterisk, it's a footnote. And, was there a way to actually make this part of the everydayness of the work? And so, John, just really appreciate, both your support and sometimes how you've challenged us to think about things differently. And thanks for being on the call.
It's my pleasure.
Great. Thank you. And let's take this moment maybe to pivot. I don't know if I'm turning it to David or Stacy to kind of set us up for those who would like to stay on, which we hope you will, to kind of see where we want to take some of the ideas that were seated in this earlier part. Thanks again, John Powell.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. This was concludes our formal collective session. And for those of you who have to go, we thank you for joining us. And for those of you who like to have more conversation and dialogue, we're literally going to go into breakout rooms where you'll have plenty of opportunity to engage with several of your other colleagues, maybe even partners. And we're going to take into those breakout rooms 3 questions. And I believe you should be able to see them on the screen. And, before we go into the breakouts, I'm going to share a little bit of a reflection on what we heard. But think about these questions. What am I taking from the conversation? Where am I seeing or feeling opportunities for growth? Where do I see my own learning edge? And how will we put these ideas into action? So think about those as I remind us of a few of the major takeaways. We had a lot of golden nuggets in this particular conversation. And I'm just going to give you a tidbit of what caught my attention. First, our systems, much like our budgets, are the most prominent reflection of our values. So let's spend a part of this moment to be present to our ways of being as much as we do to our budgets, practices, protocols, cultures, and systems. And then in regards to specific disease states such as diabetes, we can no longer afford to have these systems and cultures that produce disease continue to operate unchecked, unabetted, unrestructured, if you will. Because the production of disease, we must strike at the root of the causes. It was also acknowledged around the huge amount of distrust that communities of color have in government. And I think this is tied to the comments around every individual needing to kind of do their own work in terms of researching the history of our nation. It's very difficult to understand that distrust if we're operating in a vacuum where there's no level of awareness of things that our own government have done in terms of policies and practices and so forth. And that, as John Powell had mentioned, the community needs to be involved in collecting the data and setting the norms and be a part of the evaluation, but without the same levels of restrictions that have been often laid in the past. Yes, there's a need for resources and guidance, but the restrictions and fitting round pegs into square holes is a part of the issue and the challenge. And then last, I want to mention, the question was raised, how do we turn to people who are most impacted to let them tell us how we can best support them and connect with them? If we don't rebuild these systems and structures and policies, this will just be a moment. So again, I want to remind you of the questions. What are you taking from the conversation? What are you seeing or feeling opportunities for growth? Where are you seeing opportunities for growth? Where do you see your own learning edge? And then how will we put these ideas into action? And with that, we're going to send you off into your breakouts. I don't believe they were pre-selected, but we'll return at the end and see if there's some sharing we can offer to one another. How much time will we have in the breakout, Stace?
15 minutes.
15 minutes in the breakouts. So we'll see you on the other side of 15 minutes.
Hey there, did you call in on a separate line? Should I put you in a breakout room?
Yeah, sorry, I had to be on another Zoom, and I realized with the breakout rooms, I didn't want to bust back in. So this will be recorded, won't it, Tiffany?
It is recorded except for the breakout rooms.
Yeah, that's yeah, it is just an excellent. So I want to get the recording, and I thank you for getting back to me. But I thought I'd be, since I had to miss much of the center part of it for another Zoom, I'll wait for the recording. Thank you.
Okay, you bet. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I'm sorry, Cedric. I did not mean to leave the break room right then. I was trying to move the box out of the way. So talk to you guys.
Is this a new breakout room?
No, I think we're just the first ones back at the large group gathering, and I didn't mean to click exit. So I'm sorry.
All right, Tiffany, are we mostly back, you think? Everyone should be back by now?
Yes.
All right. We've got about 6 minutes, I believe, to maybe have anyone share from any of their breakout sessions, something that they found fairly powerful or compelling, or even just simply worth repeating. So open forum, unmute yourself, and we invite folks to share from your experiences in the breakouts. Anyone?
This is Jackie Julian. I just wanted to share one of the things that I thought was powerful in our breakout session is one of the folks talked about how they're leaning in, but specifically, so I was in the room with Teresa, Linda, and Isabella, and Linda was sharing how I believe she's in a position of power, but how she's just shifted, and so what she's reading and how that's created space to allow folks on her team to call out microaggressions, and then they have those conversations. And so I thought it was just really powerful as she acknowledged that, you know, she's reading how to be anti-racist, that, you know, you're anti-racist or you're a racist, and like comfortable in the conversation and leading that in her organization. So I thought that was a nice takeaway.
Thank you. Anyone else? Someone else? Don't be shy.
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in. This is Beverly here, and Vanessa and Tammy and Barbara and I were having a great conversation about how we as leaders try to set this atmosphere and people, and some of the awkwardness around that. And I know as a female, there are ways that I've been socialized to not, that power is uncomfortable and that power is, you know, not feminine or whatever. And recognizing in my privilege and being white, that aspect of having validity and credibility in situations where others may not have that. So sometimes it's been sharing with the rest of the staff and saying, I'm really uncomfortable being an executive director and having a title. I see us as equal. And that helped me get to the point to recognize where I have power and to be okay with it more, not completely. And so doing that with seeing all of each other as our clients too, the staff, the colleagues, all of us working together, creating that space and sticking your neck out, being uncomfortable, saying the awkward pieces.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Someone else. We've still got a whole 3 minutes left. Someone else, anyone else?
One of the things that was shared in my group with Nicole Willis, Candace Wilson, and Beth Ruth was Candace just kind of dropped some big knowledge on us at the end. And one of the things that she said was the essence of belonging is purpose. And I wrote it down because I'm gonna have to sit with that longer, because that's like, my mind is blown. And, you know, I think that that's kind of where we all wanna be, is that we all want a purpose. And the essence of that is belonging. Because when we are all together, working together, and working kind of as one. And we all come from different backgrounds and aspects and everything. But the amazing beauty behind that of coming together and belonging, that brings purpose. And isn't that what we want? I mean, Candace, that blew me away. Like, my day can continue and it's going to be amazing. Like, that just blew my mind. So thank you, Candace.
Yes, yes. Very, very powerful concept. We probably have time for one more short, brief sharing. Anyone?
I'll speak, even though I'm looking at your faces and it feels like, oh my gosh, there's so many people here. My name is Vanessa Villavicencio, and one of the things that I kept on thinking is the conversation we had about, the main conversation about structures, and this way of defining structures of, what was it that was said, kind of these habits, collective habits. And I just felt like, what a great rephrasing of and explaining, even in my little small agency, let's rethink our collective habits, and not only in service of clients, but staff. And we're in the process of creating a little equity team to begin looking at policies and procedures to begin the work internally. And it reminded me of that, just going that direction of how do we pay attention to the collective habits at all levels, to continue this conversation. And my other point was, I am so grateful for these spaces. And I remember the last words I think that David Gibbs said before the breakouts is that, please don't let this be another moment. I felt that's what my young staff continue to tell me. How do we not, there's an urgency to not let this be another moment, even though I'm enjoying the space. There's a lot of spaces where my learning edge or my needs is, as a director or leader, how do I continue to do well on behalf of my staff so they can serve better their clients? Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Very, very powerful. Clearly a lot of good dialogue and exchange. I'm appreciative of the fact that so many of you decide to hang around for this extra dialogue, because this is very much a part of the work. And so I want to turn it over to my colleague, Stacy, who's got a couple of mentions for some upcoming activities.
Yeah, thanks, David. Just lifting up, it's here on the slide, and it's available at the link that Hillary has prepared as a part of the, again, lead up activities for August. So just pointing out that the next opportunity to convene, and in fact to be able to join about 25 different communities from around the country to learn together with those who are All-American City awardees this year from the National Civic League. So that Dialogue for Action is on Thursday, July 23rd. The registration again is on the webpage listed below. And then David will be back with us to help host the Power of Story, Tools for Narrative Change, the end of July, just before we turn to being together for the August convening. And with that, Liz wanted to offer for you to be sort of last voice in the room today, if you would.
Oh, wow. I get to close. You know, number one, just, you know, so appreciate the community initiatives team helping us to frame and kind of shape this call, because the desire to do the call is always great. Trying to figure out how to do it is the work. So thank you all for that. I actually am walking away with, you know, thinking about how much we have invested in COVID. Perhaps bad investments and as well as good investments. But, you know, the whole notion of having like a response to this pandemic, trying to figure out recovery strategies, I'm wondering if that's what we need in terms of advancing equity, addressing structural racism. Like, we've got some immediate response things that may be immediate for the next 12 months, but how do we actually come up with a longer term recovery approach that has some really specific strategies that we can incorporate individually as well as collectively. Because I think the comment that someone made about how we are exhausting our colleagues of color by asking them to help us, like, are there some of those things that we could be doing collectively so that we're not doing 120 one-off versions of asking the same people to help us? But, you know, some of this is about us individually, and some of this is just, do we want to live in a place where people have a sense that they are treasured and nourished being in this space that we're in? And I'm so excited and gratified to see so much energy pointing us in the same direction and trying to get us along those same paths. So thank you all.
And with that, we will close out and look forward to seeing each and every one of you at some of our future dates and opportunities. And thank you again so much, and have a great afternoon.